What is up, everyone? It's Quinn here, and in this video, I'm going to be going through my Week 13 quarterback start sits. So going through every single starting quarterback, listing them as either a start, fringe option, or a sit. The start's going to be your mid to high-end QB1s, the players you just feel very confident throwing into your lineup. The fringe plays, more your back-end QB1s, high-end QB2s. We definitely do have some fantasy-relevant quarterbacks on bye, so it may be a little bit thin this week at the position. But let's just dive right into the Thursday night game with the Seahawks taking on the Cowboys. For the Seahawks, I feel like we have to have Geno Smith as a sit here. He hasn't been great as a fantasy option throughout the season, and he's drawing a really tough matchup here against this Cowboys defense. Really just not a spot where I want to be firing him up for fantasy. Now for the Cowboys, you got to continue to ride the hot hand here with Dak. At this point, he's pretty much a high-end QB1 in terms of points per game. He's playing at a very, very high level, so you have to fire him up here as a very, very strong start. Now looking at Sunday, we have the Chargers taking on the Patriots. Justin Herbert coming off a not-so-great game against a very, very tough Ravens defense. A little bit of a softer matchup here against the Patriots. I like Justin Herbert as a strong start. Even lacking weapons, he still continues to produce for you. Now for the Patriots, we don't know if it's going to be Mac Jones or Bailey Zappi, but we do know that we do not want to be playing either of those guys. Even in a nice matchup here against the Chargers, this Patriots offense is just so rough. I do not think we want to be throwing either of those quarterbacks into your lineup. Even in like super deep leagues, you're also running the risk of one of them getting pulled, when they're struggling early on. So just a situation you should want no part of. Then looking at the Lions taking on the Saints here. For the Lions, I feel like Jared Goff is a fine fringe play. That's pretty much where he's at on a point per game basis. Not a great matchup here against the Saints, but not like a total killer. He has struggled as of late with the turnovers. I think he'll be fine, but I'm definitely not overly excited to fire him up into my lineup as my quarterback one. The next matchup, definitely one of the grosser ones here at the quarterback position. Falcons taking on the Jets. Desmond Ridder back at quarterback. I guess he didn't have the worst game, but definitely not fantasy relevant. And then Tim Boyle, potentially the worst quarterback in the NFL at this point. Definitely going to be a sit for me. Also, both those defenses are somewhat tough, so just makes it worse. In the next one, we have the Cardinals taking on the Steelers. Since coming back off of IR, Kyler Murray has been a very solid option. 3 pretty strong fantasy performances. Not really scared of the Steelers matchup, so I like Kyler as a pretty confident start this week. On the other side for the Steelers, we saw Kenny Pickett have like a fine game. Probably the Steelers' best overall offensive game of the season, and he does draw a nice matchup here against the Cardinals. I'm just not going to be all the way back on board here. Not that I really ever was like the Kenny Pickett bandwagon, but I'm not going to be overly optimistic for this game. Even in a nice matchup, I would still be sitting Kenny Pickett this week. Not so great matchup here with the Colts taking on the Titans. For the Colts, these are guys, I guess, in the range where if you're super desperate, your quarterback's on bye, injured, whatever it may be, I guess these guys, could be your really desperate plays. But still, Gardner Minshew, Will Levis, these guys have not produced pretty much on the season. Will Levis, since that big game, has not been super fantasy relevant. So ideally, you would be sitting these two quarterbacks here. In the next one, definitely getting back to some better quarterback matchups here. We have the Dolphins taking on the Commanders. Tua, fantasy-wise, not coming off a great game on Black Friday, but this is a prime matchup here going up against the Commanders. I believe they have allowed the most fantasy points per game to the quarterback position. Got to feel very solid starting Tua in this one. And then for the Commanders, Sam Howell just continues to produce. He pretty much has like one flop performance, maybe one like 9-point game. Other than that, he has been a very consistent, very reliable fantasy play. He's going to go out there. He's going to sling it. I like Sam Howell here as a nice start. In the next one, we have the Broncos taking on the Texans. This Broncos team on a nice run here. Russ isn't really killing it fantasy-wise, but in a week with 6 teams on bye, I think he's a fine fringe play. They're not asking him to go out and, throw for 1,000,000 yards every single game, but he's starting to use his legs more, which can give him some nice production. So I have Russ here as like a fringe play, probably a high-end QB2 this week for the Texans. CJ Stroud continues to ball out. Not really scared of this Broncos defense here, so I like CJ Stroud once again as a start this week. In a divisional matchup between the Panthers and the Buccaneers, definitely going to be sitting Bryce Young. We'll see what kind of changes they make with the coaching shakeup, but I don't think it's going to like completely flip Bryce Young's season around like in a 180. I think he'll definitely still be a sit here. And then for the Buccaneers, this is a spot where you'd like to have Baker Mayfield as like a fringe play with, a lot of quarterbacks on bye. But the Panthers have really just been tough against opposing fantasy quarterbacks. They're bottom 5 in terms of points per game allowed, meaning they've, allowed very few points to the quarterback position. So I really don't feel great about Baker in this spot here going up against the Panthers. In the next one, we have the Browns taking on the Rams. For the Browns, whether it's DTR or PJ Walker, this is definitely a quarterback situation you just want to be avoiding at this point. And then for the Rams, Matthew Stafford coming off, I believe, his best game of the season fantasy-wise, 4 passing touchdowns. It's kind of a tough spot here because he draws a really tough matchup just a week later. So I have him as a sit. I could definitely see an argument for a fringe play, and of all the sits, he'd probably be the guy I'd be most willing to play just because I like his weapons, and I do think he's like a solid NFL quarterback. But this Browns defense has been tough. Obviously, last week they gave up some points, but that really hasn't been a consistent thing for them. So Stafford's going to be a sit, but if you are desperate, I don't hate it. The next one, definitely a solid quarterback matchup here. 49ers taking on the Eagles. For the 49ers, the Eagles have been a pretty solid matchup here for fantasy quarterbacks. Brock Purdy's been solid, surrounded by some stud weapons. I'm firing him up as a nice start. And then for the Eagles here, definitely a tough matchup against the 49ers, but Jalen Hurts is in that tier of quarterback where he has the high-end QB1 ceiling. Regardless of matchup, he is going to be a locked-in play for you in your lineup. Then looking at the Sunday night game with the Chiefs taking on the Packers. For the Chiefs, even without great weapons, Patrick Mahomes is still a solid, probably mid-tier QB1 at this point. He's a start for me. For the Packers, Jordan Love coming off a nice game. This is just a tough matchup here against the Chiefs. This defense definitely hasn't been great towards opposing fantasy quarterbacks, so I have Jordan Love as a fringe option. Probably like a fringe QB1 this week. In a better matchup, he could have been a start, but he does draw the Chiefs here. And then the final game of the week, Monday Night Football. For the Bengals, with no Joe Burrow, you're definitely not firing up Jake Browning. And then for the Jaguars, we're finally starting to get those strong fantasy performances out of Trevor Lawrence. Earlier on in the season, he really wasn't playing poorly from like a real-life NFL perspective. The touchdowns just were not there fantasy-wise. Over the last 2 weeks, the touchdowns have come. Calvin Ridley's putting up big games. Trevor Lawrence is balling out. So I think you have to feel good about him. I like him as a start this week. With 6 teams on bye, definitely some higher-end QB1s missing. I like Trevor Lawrence as someone you can count on here in Week 13. And that's going to wrap it up for all the Week 13 QB matchups. Hopefully you're in a decent spot this week. If you did have one of those guys on bye, hopefully you have like one of the decent streaming options, or maybe you're just in a good enough spot that it doesn't really matter. If you guys are interested in all the other start sits, running backs, wide receivers were posted yesterday. Tight ends will be out today. Running back and wide receiver rankings out tomorrow. But that's wrapping it up for this one. Thank you for stopping by, and I will see you in the next one.